I was looking forward to this conversation we'll have about jazz, past, present, future.
Yeah.
Everything around jazz. And the 800-pound question, I think, in the room is, your profession relies on you being able to interact with a live audience and with live students and pupils. And in this era of the quarantine, how have you been able to sustain your livelihood as a professional jazz musician?
It is certainly the 800-pound question in the room, Rich, and it's, I think, something we're all still navigating. It's been a shock, to say the least, but I'm very grateful to have the support of and involvement with organizations like Rockport Music and Jazz at Lincoln Center, especially for me, as sort of a hub in New York City. And so these organizations, like Jazz at Lincoln Center and these venues that I was scheduled to play at or tour at or teach at, they all transitioned to a virtual workflow very quickly. And some chose not to, and many have, and now you see more and more transitioning as if this is what it's going to be forever, which is really crazy to think about. And so for us, it's meant becoming our own sound engineers, becoming our own graphic designers, becoming our own sort of MCs and commentators, becoming our own booking and agents and managers and all of that stuff. So, I'm very grateful to have had the education with some of those software programs that maybe I wouldn't have had before.
One thing that I've noticed is now a lot of people are jumping on virtual concerts. Some people are good with it, and some people are not as comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. Are you learning things about virtual performances now that you didn't know when you started?
Well, there are definitely pros and cons to the situation. What I love about live performances, I really feed off of the audience, and I love to interact with the audience and actually have the audience sometimes dictate the set list. I'll give a little bit of a vote at times to pick song A or song B. And so that's not really as possible virtually, but I have to give Stephen a lot of the technology credit because he did a ton of research and found all of these programs, and now we've got intro music and outro music, and we've got, a poll feature on Crowdcast.
Jazz is really sort of woven into the history of America. And it's really a uniquely American art form. Mm-hmm. And yet it only comprises about 1% to 2% of all the commercial music played in the country. As the director of the Rockport Jazz Workshop, why is jazz still important to be taught?
This is my favorite question. So Rockport Jazz Workshop, I hope if you're tuning in, I hope I've had the chance to meet you. If you have not experienced our fun and joy at Rockport Jazz Workshop, I hope you can come see us soon. It's truly the highlight of my year. Jazz education and music education provides tools for these students to go on into their lives and succeed, whether they're musicians or not. So qualities that we are developing include simple everyday needs, for human interaction, such as respect and responsibility, listening, empathy, being able to articulate your thoughts, whether you're speaking on stage and announcing your tune, or whether you're performing a solo and you need to get a lick or a line out in a clear way. And work ethic and dedication, time management, all of these qualities go into practicing at home or practicing in a rehearsal with an ensemble, and understanding how to work in a team. And ideally, those people become ambassadors for jazz and arts and why it's so important, why we can't cut the arts programs in our schools. So we're sort of just spreading the love in that way.
I think when I think about jazz and jazz education, I think about a jazz ensemble as being sort of the little microcosm of a perfect democracy. You have all of these people collectively have to work together. They have to listen to each other and they have to speak to each other. Mm-hmm. And once in a while, somebody gets to stand up and give a speech. Mm-hmm. And they say that out, and they can be themselves, say what they want, and the other people have to support them. Or they might encourage them to take another direction by whatever the person backing them up, and then they have to listen to that. And then they sit down. But it's all about collective communication and hearing each other. And isn't that a great thing? Let me ask you this. How do you teach jazz to children or anybody? What's the process that you introduce this musical form to them?
So a lot of people find jazz to be overwhelming. It seems complicated. It seems like, oh, I couldn't possibly take a solo. I couldn't possibly improvise with all those long lines and those fast notes and all of that. But at the core, we all have a voice, and singing is really just at the root of that. When you take the instruments away, it's all about singing and moving and keeping the beat and the groove and the melody in your body. And so when we look at these songs, in jazz, really the fundamental song form is the blues. And so, you can play as complicated as you'd like, giant steps, John Coltrane songs, whatever, as advanced as you want to get, the blues is always there, and it's really the core of our music. And so I generally start there, whether it's a young student or an adult who perhaps took up an instrument in high school and hasn't touched it since. And so what we do at Rockport Jazz Workshop, which is a curriculum that I've developed based on an educational method called Jump Right In, or music learning theory. It's all based on learning by ear. So you don't have to worry about music. You don't have to worry about the music stand. What we do is we take a small, simple melody, and we break it up into chunks, and it's just all about call and response and really getting the student to get it ingrained in that way. So if it were the two of us, I would perhaps teach us the melody, and we'd get the hang of it after a while, bit by bit. And then I'd also teach us the bass line to kind of get an understanding of the harmony, what the judicial branch might be playing. And just with those two fundamental elements, which you'd be surprised how quick it moves, with those two fundamental elements, we can play a duet together. We can communicate together. And then that's where the magic happens. And then that's where the people get hooked, because they realize, oh, you're in that spot, so I'm going here. That's right. Okay, so I'm on this note, and then you move there, and that's when I work with you and go there. So just these little tiny movements start to create like this eye-opening sort of moment of, okay, we're working together.
I can attest to that as well. We've been to the workshop the last couple of times, and I've seen this in action during the times that we were there. And I must say, I was kind of stunned when I first heard that, well, they don't have to read music. And I'm thinking, well, how do you play the music then? But you explained it, and I saw it happen. Mm-hmm. And it was wonderful to see this, because I'm thinking, these people, once that happens, as you say, the light bulb goes off, they will seek training, because they'll say, I want more of this. Mm-hmm. This just feels good. Well, it's an interesting instrument, the saxophone. Mm-hmm. And you know what? I'm always sort of interested in the saxophone as being this sort of iconic instrument.
Absolutely.
Associated with jazz. If you see a poster for a jazz festival or anything having to do with jazz, it's either a trumpet or usually a saxophone. Mm-hmm. But the saxophone was never invented to be used as a jazz instrument.
Right.
It was, I think, middle of the 1800s, Adolph Sax invented the saxophone to be used in military marching bands.
Yes.
The symphonic world didn't have saxophones. They didn't know what a saxophone was supposed to sound like. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that if you listen to very early recordings of jazz bands, when the saxophone appears comes to play, they sound odd. They sound kind of high, mm-hmm. kind of squeaky. Mm-hmm. The approach to the saxophone is very odd. And there was really no kind of acceptable sound for mm-hmm. the saxophone when it went from marching bands into jazz bands. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until Coleman Hawkins in the 20s with Fletcher Henderson mm-hmm. stood up and started playing the saxophone with this, what we would call the correct tone production mm-hmm. of a saxophone. A big, full, mellifluous sound, and suddenly jazz saxophone was born. And I think 90 years later, this is the standard of what we expect. Because prior to that, the saxophone was almost a novelty instrument.
Right, exactly.
It was used to make squeaks and whinnies, and mm-hmm. it sounded actually almost more like a clarinet.
Yes.
Like they were playing it like a clarinet.
Yes.
So now we have the sound of a real jazz saxophone out of that. But over the years, saxophone styles and jazz styles must have changed and have changed. They certainly have. Can you explain how the difference between, let's say, the way jazz saxophone is played today than it was maybe 20 or even 10 years ago? Mm-hmm. younger jazz musicians approaching this saxophone differently?
You bring up a really great point of starting with Coleman Hawkins, and I think for saxophonists who are very serious, those influential artists, Coleman Hawkins, Dexter Gordon, John Coltrane, Lester Young, who we maybe didn't have the opportunity to see, but we certainly have the opportunity to hear their major records. We have studied all of them, but perhaps not with the idea of replicating, but with the idea of moving it forward. And so now what we start to see, after, as you're noting, like maybe the past 10 or 20 years, people, might call it modern jazz. Maybe you play bebop, maybe you play swing, or early New Orleans style jazz, or maybe you're like a modern jazz player. And so things might sound. I think the stereotype is that it's a little more angular, maybe a little obtuse, a little edgy. But I think that's probably largely because it's very based in original compositions. A lot of people are writing their own music, and so you might not hear Take the A Train all the time. But the saxophonists that are really out there, and a lot of my peers and colleagues and people that I look up to, if you sit them down and say, can you tell me what you thought about Lester Young? That person would absolutely be able to play Lester Young's very famous solo on Lady Be Good, or Charlie Parker's, My Little Suede Shoes solo.
So when you're teaching kids or anybody about jazz, you're teaching them certainly about the music, but there is, again, a history of jazz. And do you get to weave that in the history along with the music? Because so much of our American history is tied up really kind of into race relations, and race is kind of the history of America, and jazz is right there moving along with it. Quite often it's in response to civil rights issues, or it grows out of segregation and things of that sort.
Yes.
You touch on the history of those touch points along jazz's line that reflect that.
Yeah, it's imperative that the students know where the music is coming from, because otherwise it's just not genuine if you're performing the music without an understanding of the history. So it's similarly to that jazz and democracy style talk. Actually at Rockport Jazz Workshop, our bass faculty, Emiliano Lisansky, he's developed just an amazing set of classes that we present to the students. And it's, by the third day even, he'll put up the photos of the people that he spoke about earlier in the week, and he'll quiz the students, and he'll say, who's that? And you'll see, third grade young boys and girls going, oh, that's Ella Fitzgerald, Ella. Or they'll say, okay, he'll show a picture of Louis Armstrong, and he'll say, what was his nickname? And they'll go, Pops, Satchmo. And it's really, it's almost like having baseball cards, like trivia cards, for jazz characters. And so when the students hear about the real juicy stuff about these people's lives, they were on the road going to this place and this place every night, and then they had rent parties because rent was going up, and and because of the Great Migration, people moved from the South to New York City, and everyone sort of congregated in Harlem, and they couldn't pay their rent because the rent charges were being forced up, and they were almost being kind of forced out, and so they would have these rent parties, and who was the king of the rent parties? Oh, Fats Waller, and let's have our own rent party here. Who's going to be the leader of the band? So those types of things, those little elements that can feel very relevant to the students today are really exciting for them.
Oh, that's great. That's amazing just to know that history is being passed on. I would love to see some little kid raise his hand and say, Charlie Mingus. I like Charlie Mingus.
Yes.
That would be like, I wouldn't believe that could happen. And it's so encouraging to me to know that history is being ingrained at such a young age. I think we told you about a concert with Christian McBride here, one of the first years. And he came here, and at the break, he said, we're going to take a break, and then we'll be back in 15 minutes. But before I go, I want to say thank you to you right here in the front row for bringing your two little kids with them to the jazz, because that is how this starts. It started for you that way. It started for me. It started for a lot of people. You don't know it's there until you're introduced to it. And Christian said it was so great that the father brought these two little kids, I don't know, 6, 7 years old, to this jazz concert. And I think Ulysses almost might have been the drummer that night.
Probably, yes.
And he did a very classy thing that'll stick with me forever. He watched that and heard what Christian was saying, and they got up to leave, and Ulysses picked up a couple of drumsticks and handed it to the kid on the way out. And I thought,
Amazing.
that little person's going to remember when that big man came up and gave me those drumsticks.
Yes.
What a seed to be planted.
That's how it happens, absolutely.
But I've noticed also there's this sort of breaking down the doors of traditional jazz harmonies into creating jazz that encompasses the entire musical canon of music. I think it goes back to the Cone concert that Keith Jarrett was doing as a traditional jazz pianist.
Right.
And basically what he was doing with those is saying that I am not going to play strict jazz chords. I'm going to play the full order of harmonies, and that is going to be my jazz.
Right.
And do you see that happening? Do you see that happening more or less? Again, it's all out there all at the same time.
Right. I think today, with the music that's being made, like in this generation, or even the people that are just slightly younger than me, I'll listen to those records and I'll say, what is that? What was that? I don't even know what that was, you know? And I'll check with the person and they'll say, oh, well, I just came up with this thing and it's something I never would have ever thought of. Or, oh, I was listening to Stravinsky's this and I never would have thought of that. And actually, speaking of Stravinsky, there are so many stories of Charlie Parker being on stage and quoting, you know, Firebird. Or all these pieces, you know, because he was at home checking that stuff out, and all of a sudden he would play a little piece of that. So that's an example of, you know, if you're a Stravinsky fan, we can connect you right to Charlie Parker.
Right. I'll tell one more funny story. It was that Horowitz and Art Tatum were friends, and Horowitz heard Art Tatum play like T for Two or something, and Horowitz went back to his apartment and worked up this multi-variation on T for Two, and worked weeks on it, you know, writing this tremendous knuckle breaker of a piece. And he invited Art Tatum up to hear it. And he played it, and Art said that was great. And then Art sat down and played the whole thing. And Horowitz asked him, oh, that's wonderful. When did you write that? And Tatum said, just now. Of course, you knew that was coming.
Yep, that's the best.
So that was a wonderful story, an example of great jazz playing.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been an absolute delight. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you.
I know that you're out there prospering and doing well, and I hope it continues for you. And I really look forward to having you back here at the Jazz Workshop and on our stage and performing. Thanks again for coming out and having this chat with us.
Thank you so much, Rich. Thanks to everyone watching. And I think before we go, I'd love to play a little something for my people.
I won't argue with that. Please do.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening.